I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me again today. And we've got a fascinating guest on today, one who tells a story really of resilience, not just for him, but also of his family, because he has gone through something that is, well, unlike any of our other guests, impossibly hard. And that is that he was taken hostage inside Syria by the Syrian army, held inside Damascus in one of their worst prisons. Didn't know if he was going to be held for days or years. And through an incredible set of connections, managed to finally be released back into Lebanon. But he's written a book called Saving Sam, the true story of an American's disappearance in Syria and his family's extraordinary fight to bring him home. And he talks about all elements of that today, and I'm pretty sure you guys are going to really enjoy this. So here's Sam. Look, Sam, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a great pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me on.
I suppose I don't have many guests on who have been taken hostage and been by themselves, really locked up alone for so long. And that's something that I want to talk about as well, your mind frame during those moments. But why don't we start at the beginning? Why don't you tell me briefly about what happened, what you were first doing inside Syria, and how you got there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So from 2010 to 2020, those 10 years, most of which I spent living and working overseas. I was in Singapore for 6 and in Dubai for 1. I traveled to every country in the world. And on that journey to 193 countries, the 181st country that I traveled to was Syria. And I arrived there, and just 2 hours later, I was walking through a roundabout on the way to meet up with my guide when all of a sudden a black pickup truck abruptly pulled up next to me. 2 armed men jumped out of the back seat and instructed me to get inside. And thankfully they weren't violent, but I didn't have a choice. And as we sped down back alleys of the city, the officers in the vehicle accused me of espionage, of being an American spy, of collaborating with terrorists, and nothing like this had ever happened to me before. And I went on to be held. They held me for 9 weeks in some pretty uncomfortable situations, which I can talk about today. But this was in 2019. On July 26th, I was peacefully released through the help of primarily the Lebanese. And in the wake of that, have really been reflecting and trying to pull things out that I think are helpful to others. But that's kind of in a nutshell what happened.
And it's fascinating as well how you were released. And we'll talk about that as well in a little bit. But I've got to start at the first one with a question, which is, why did you want to travel to every country in the world?
For me, travel was always about learning. It was about a better understanding of the world. Travel is the best education I've ever had. It was originally never about ticking boxes or checking places off a list. But as I lived overseas longer and traveled more, some for work and some for pleasure, I realized that I had been to about 120 countries in the world. And at that point, I remember thinking, well, how many are there? And maybe I could go to all of them. And the competitive athlete in me kicked in a little bit. And so it kind of organically became this goal of going to every country, which at the time only about 100 people in history had ever done. So I feel really fortunate for the experiences and the perspectives that have come from it. But to answer your question, it was originally always about just learning.
And I have to ask you the tough question, which is also that some people will say, are you not putting, say, the State Department and other places at risk by choosing to go to a dangerous country like Syria if there's no other reason? I mean, some people would call it sort of conflict tourism, or just going to these places when maybe there was no benefit to it.
Yep. Even people in my immediate family thought I was unrealistic with my travel goal, particularly in these places. And one of the most significant things that I've learned is that places that are negatively perceived or that Western media tells us we're not supposed to like, these were the same places where I had many of my best experiences. At the same time, safety is always the top priority. I don't think it's cool to be in unsafe situations, but there was this paradox here of these being the places where I had many of my best experiences. I mean, for example, I camped at the base of Angel Falls in Venezuela. I coached the North Korean national hockey team. I celebrated New Year's Eve on Kish Island in Iran. I went to a Formula E race in Saudi Arabia, and I'm grateful to say that the list goes on. And so it was always this balance between better understanding the world, but also staying safe. And despite the instability in Syria, I was confident the same was going to be the case. And it wasn't the case. And it became very uncomfortable. But in the wake of that, there's been so much good that's happened. And that's really what I'm trying to focus on today.
Yeah. I've been in and out of Syria for the last 15 years or so. And I've been recently up into Qamishli as well, and then further on to Raqqa and the rest. And I know what that journey is like. You cross the border from Iraq, you head on down. And Qamishli, of course, is an interesting position because, it's largely controlled by the Kurds, the SDF, but there are still pockets of Syrian government there. And I suppose it was the Syrian armed forces who found you. Do you think that they knew you were there? Had they heard you were coming, or did you run into a checkpoint of theirs?
You know what? I'm not exactly sure. I think it could have been sort of a combination, and maybe wrong place, wrong time, maybe my travel history. It's kind of hard to know. And even locals in Qamishli find it difficult to kind of navigate the kind of checkerboard of people controlling the area. So it's a conflicted area. It's controlled by different people, and was caught up in that.
Yeah, we ran into the Syrian army a few years ago up in that part of Syria, and we didn't know what to do. And we said, let's just jump out of the van and hug them and interview them instead. So we all jumped out and we hugged them, and we pretended that we were some random television network, and they gave us all these interviews and waved us on our way. And
maybe that's what I should have done.
Yeah, but we thought, as we were sitting in the van, that's it. Those are Syrian army. We're about to get caught, and we know what happens if you get caught, because Austin Tice, journalist, 12 years ago or so, he was taken by them. He's disappeared ever since. They may still be holding him. But we know what happens when the Syrian government get you, and they did get you. They did realize you were American, and they took you in Qamishli, which is in the northeast of Syria, but then they moved you down to Damascus. At what point did you realize this wasn't just being held by some group, that you were now a hostage, and this situation was a lot worse than you imagined?
Well, it took me some time to really figure out what had happened initially. I thought it was a misunderstanding. I thought that they were going to finally figure out who I was saying I was, but they flew me from Qamishli to Damascus in the cargo hold of a Syrian military airplane. And from there, it was taken from the airport into the center of town, into the basement of a facility that I now know is called Syria's military intelligence prison, number 215, a facility notoriously known for housing political prisoners, and in fact, a facility that some folks in the intelligence community in the U.S. government believe Austin Tice was held in at some point. And I remained here in solitary confinement for 27 days. And then as time went on, that was when I really started to kind of get to your question, that I think maybe this isn't going to be resolved in just a couple of days. Maybe they do believe that I'm some kind of threat to their national security. However, that could even be possible. And that time in solitary confinement is emotional and psychological torture, and that was how I spent the first month there with very little information. That was really the most challenging part of it, was the uncertainty of the situation.
How do you spend your days? I mean, I know that you only very little human interaction, that you only saw people when food was delivered to you maybe twice a day, and that wasn't a lot of food at all. But is it just sitting there and thinking back? Is there a lot of sort of, are you suddenly angry at yourself at one point for getting in this specific situation? You think of your family a lot. You thinking at moments this is going to be fine and a way through, and at other moments you thinking I'm never getting out of it. Like, is it an emotional roller coaster throughout the day? Because that's days and days and days of just being alone, not knowing where you are. And I imagine that's tough.
Yeah, it was emotionally and psychologically exhausting. In fact, about 6 months after I came home, I was invited uh, to Fort Bragg in North Carolina to speak to the SEER team, the U.S. government SEER team, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. And these are military officials in the United States who are frequently put on missions where they're at risk of being captured, and they wanted to talk. They wanted to hear me talk about this exact question that you just asked. Basically, how did I cope? What did I do without any training? And it turned out that several of the things that I did were things that they teach in their program. The first was to develop a routine. And I had this kind of routine that I developed in the cell to pass the time. I would try to sleep as long as I could, and then I would exercise. I did push-ups, sit-ups, core exercises. I would then try to take my mind out of the cell. I would pretend the cell was full of people and tell stories to kind of an imaginary audience, which sound kind of weird now, but I spent a lot of time praying. My faith, I leaned on a lot of things for strength, but my faith was most important. I view the world through a spiritual lens, and I believe that this wasn't the end, but there was this routine that I developed. But as you mentioned, the most challenging part of the entire situation was the uncertainty. I had no idea how or when this was going to end, and sometimes I tell people that, if I told you that you were going to go and sit in a prison cell for 27 days in solitary confinement, eat bread and boiled potatoes and water, and on day 27, they're going to move you somewhere else. I'm not saying you'd be comfortable, but I'm saying that you'd be in a completely different situation than if you did not have that known finish line.
Yeah, and you say prisoners count down and days down, hostages count the days going up.
Exactly. I was just a year or two after I came home, I was watching a movie, and it was this prisoner in his cell, and he had a calendar, and he was marking off the days until the end of his sentence. And it got a trigger. Well, geez, he was counting down, but I had my own calendar that I had carved into the concrete wall of the cell, but I was counting up.
You're listening to Searching for Heroes. We'll be right back after this. You talk about the interrogation because obviously at first, they would have thought that you could have been an intelligence agency, and hours and hours, you finally spoke to someone who had an American accent. You never saw him. You were blindfolded the whole time, but they were just throwing questions at you. And you think that was really an attempt to catch you, to see if your story of being a world traveler was real, or if they could catch you out in some way. I mean, what were those interrogations like?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think they were trying to figure out if I was who I was saying I was. And later, after I came home, we kind of put these pieces together and realized that we're pretty sure that a lot of this interrogation was initiated as a result of my family connecting with the Lebanese, and them kind of the Syrians then working to kind of talk to me and actually find some information. And in fact, I know this podcast is about searching for heroes. I really think my family are the heroes, which I can talk about. But during these interrogations, I was handcuffed and blindfolded, which is an incredibly vulnerable position to be in. As you mentioned, a man who spoke perfect English was sitting in the same room and started speaking to me. And essentially, throughout these interrogation sessions, he started from the day I was born and worked all the way up until the present day. He wanted to know everything about my life, where I'd gone to school, my hockey career, where I had worked, living overseas, and of course, why I had come to Syria. And I told him that I was traveling to every country, and they found it hard to believe that, which was frustrating because the truth was a little bit complicated, and so I struggled with that. But there were some, put in some pretty uncomfortable situations. At one point, the interrogator, he was asking me why I came to Syria, and I told him why, and he said, he said, "You're a liar." And then he said, "Sam, if you don't start telling the truth, I will do a 180 with your life. Do you want me to hand you over to ISIS? I'll do it right now." And I remember just being utterly terrified. I didn't know if there was a gun to my head. I didn't know what was happening. But in the wake of this, after debriefing, I've learned that it was probably unlikely that he was actually going to truly do that. But at the time, I didn't know that. And I thought these were very real threats. And perhaps they were, but a terrifying situation.
Yeah. And I remember that soon after Austin Tice was taken, they released a video of him supposedly in ISIS hands. But we can see from what they're wearing that was made up, that was formulated. So we know how the Syrian government plays with ISIS. And, in your mind, that must have you must have thought about that too. But this wasn't just being alone in your room. This wasn't interrogation. You, on some occasions, also could hear the torture and people being beaten in neighboring cells. So you were very aware that you were in a location, you were in a place where they were torturing people.
I was never physically harmed, but the facility was not soundproof, as you mentioned. And every day I would hear the sounds of inmates in neighboring cells screaming from being beaten and tortured. And of course, I couldn't help but wonder, when's my turn? I realized I was in an environment where nothing was off limits. And in the wake of this, I've learned more about this facility, and that this is one of the most notorious places where these things happen. Essentially, I was in a facility that is used for terrorists, for some of the worst criminals in the world, and I was in that. And I heard people being tortured. Some of them weren't even terrorists; they were just their own people who had maybe acted in a way that was against the government or however they viewed it. But I did hear these things happening, and I can still hear them in my mind today.
Yeah, and I know in your book you write both about coming across other prisoners who were in ISIS, or Daesh, as they were calling it, but also you spoke to someone. You also talk about how someone says to you, all the good people in Syria are in the prisons and all the bad ones are out of the prisons. And you came across there were a number of times when the prisoners chose to share their food with you, and as guests, you ate first. Another prisoner, Elliot, who helped you smuggle a letter out to tell your parents. Can you tell us about that letter? Because, I mean, I can imagine what happened with Elliot and how you felt suddenly having to write down this letter, try to tell your parents and your family where you were.
Yeah. So in the second month, what proved to be a second month, the second half of my captivity, I was moved from solitary confinement to more of a general population situation. And one of the most significant things I had learned through my travels is that some of the best hospitality I've ever found anywhere in the world is across the Middle East. The food, the way that people welcome us guests into their homes, some of the best hospitality I've ever found is in this region. And that proved to still be the case inside a Syrian prison. These men truly risked their life to help save mine, and were a remarkable display of humanity. And one of the most sobering comments that I heard was the one that you mentioned about all the good people being in prison. And a couple weeks into that second month, a fellow inmate of mine came and said that he could get a letter out of the prison on my behalf. And he told me that he was going to, the next day, he had a friend who was coming to visit and was going to bring clean laundry, and my inmate friend was going to give him dirty laundry, and he could put a letter in the dirty laundry and smuggle it out. And so I took that opportunity to do that. And that letter made it to it navigated this game of geopolitical telephone and made it to my father in St. Louis, and served as really the first time that I managed to communicate that I was alive. And this was the result of the kindness of complete strangers, and really just amplifies some of the most important things I've learned through my travels. I mean, the overwhelming majority of people in the world are well-intentioned, proud of their country, happy to help others. They're fundamentally good people. We're all basically the same. And this proved to be the case in a Syrian prison, and I'm still in touch with some of these men today.
But what did you write in that letter? Because you were about to give it to him, and he said, "Well, no, write something so they really know it's you."
Yeah, so I gave it to him, and he looked at it. I had written just my father's name and phone number and a couple of things of where I was, and he looked at it and said, "Hey, you should put a clue on this letter so that if it makes it to your family, they'll know for sure that it came to you and that it came from you." And I thought about that for a second, and I thought, that's a great idea. I've never been in a situation like this before, but that was so I took it and I wrote that the clue that I wrote was actually that I always order the salmon at the Missouri Athletic Club. So I'm originally from St. Louis. The MAC is this place where my family and I go to like exercise and sometimes eat. And I wrote that clue on there, and I never heard anything back. But later, when I was released, my family told me that they received the note, and when they read the clue, they basically called the FBI, who was on speed dial at that point, and said, "We have this note from Sam, and we're 100% sure that it came from Sam because of this clue." And so I'm beyond grateful to my friend who suggested I do that.
And I want to get to your family in a moment, but one other thing from your captivity, I remember you write that one point you were hyperventilating because you were trying to think of ways when you wouldn't be perhaps beaten or tortured, and you were on the way out, and you thought at one point perhaps pretending to be sick was a way, and you acted out this whole little routine.
I was in solitary confinement in the first month. I became desperate for maybe saying it as desperate for attention is potentially accurate, but it was just desperate to know that I hadn't been totally forgotten, because there was nothing happening day after day. And so I decided to kind of take a risk and see if I were to pretend to have some kind of illness or have an issue, how they would react. And they sort of responded. They did attend the situation a little bit, but it didn't lead to any kind of significant movement in my case. They basically just said, "Okay, we'll look at you. Now you're okay. Now go back to your cell."
At any point, did you have to ready yourself? Did you have times think, "I'm going to be here for years. Let me now prepare for that"? And I'm trying to imagine what that mental preparation, what that dialogue with yourself looks like. And I suppose we can talk a little bit about faith now as well, because presumably that's one of the times that would you then talk to God about that as well? Did he help you through those difficult moments when you just thought you could be there for years?
Based on the information that I had, I believed that all potential outcomes were possible. I didn't even have any information that could eliminate one of these options from the table. So, was I going to be released in 5 minutes? Well, based on the information I had, I thought that was possible. Was I going to be in that cell forever? I thought that was possible. Was I going to be released in a week? Were they going to torture me or stop feeding me or just open the door and shoot me? Based on the information I had, I believed all of these things were possible, and trying to emotionally and psychologically entertain all of these potential outcomes all the time was exhausting. And to your point, one of the things that happened was I started to believe that I would die here. And interestingly, what I discovered is that there is some comfort in death, because not a single person has ever managed to conquer it. Not even Jesus, through looking at things through a spiritual lens. And there became some comfort in that. And I became okay with that being the outcome.
Wow. That's amazing. Was your faith as strong leading into this, or did your faith sort of grow stronger as a result? Did you ask God perhaps why, how had he led you here? I mean, what sort of like deep sort of theological questions were you asking? Did you at times you question God, and were you angry at God for bringing you there? Then at other times, did you say, this must be your path and that you've chosen for me? Like, what were those thoughts like?
It was really all of those things. It was this roller coaster of trying to figure out, is this really what's supposed to happen? But maybe I can grow from this. Well, maybe if I said, God, I know you have a plan, but Is it possible? It was this negotiation. Yeah, not this one. Like, would you consider, it was almost like a business deal. Would you consider an adjustment to the timeline here? Can that work with your plan? Can I get out of here? So it was this ongoing negotiation, and my prayers became a conversation with God. I was constantly talking to him, pacing back and forth. And that was really the crux of my situation, of my prayers, trying to figure out what this meant, but also stay strong through it.
Now, the book is amazing, and it's written in this way where it's written through the eyes of everyone who's involved. So there's some of it's through your eyes, and others is through your family's eyes. And that's fascinating because it really gives us an insight into what they were doing at their end to try and get you released. And there's a lot going on at that end. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what your family were doing. The first they heard about it, and then how they kept moving forward until they finally got in touch with this Lebanese general.
Yeah, sure. So when I was released, a couple minutes after I was released, I was thinking about everything that had happened.
Will you tell us quickly about how you were released? Talk us into that first of all. So you were in a cell, and what happened up to being released?
Yeah, so it was July 26, 2019. One of the prison officials came to the cell I was in and called my name and told me I was being moved. And as he escorted me out front, he stopped and he said, Sam, you're very lucky. President Assad has agreed to release you. And this sounds encouraging, but I had been lied to so many times in the past 2 months that I had essentially become immune to believing anything like this. But I was escorted into a black SUV, and it turned out to be part of a 5-vehicle convoy that raced out of Damascus at what seemed to be 100 miles an hour. And we didn't stop at traffic lights. We used the shoulder of the road to maneuver around traffic, and we drove west towards the mountains, and nobody in the vehicle said a word. And the nice cars, the professional nature of the operation made me think that this was either really good or really bad. I'm about to experience kind of one extreme of the captivity spectrum here, but I don't know which one it is. We came up to this checkpoint, and it seemed to be some kind of significant border. And as we passed through, the officer in the vehicle sitting next to me, he quietly tapped me on the leg and he said, Sam, you're in Lebanon. You're safe now. And that was also encouraging. I was still putting the pieces together, but we drove from there into Beirut, and I was taken to the office of Lebanon's internal security, kind of like the equivalent of say, the FBI here in the United States. And when I walked into the office, in addition to dozens of government and military intelligence officials and journalists, my parents were there, which was this moment that was indescribably emotional, one that many people thought would never happen, and frankly, just this breathtaking display of God answering prayers. And getting to the point that I was making a second ago, just a few minutes later, after reuniting, I was thinking about everything that had happened with over the past 9 weeks, and I said to my parents, I said, hey, it was a little bit of a naive comment, but I said, I have a story for you. And the two of them looked at each other and then looked back at me, and my mom said, well, Sam, we have a story for you too. And this was a bit confusing for me because while I was trapped on the inside, I had no idea about anything that had happened on the outside. So as time went on and I began to put together the content for this book, I realized that half the story wasn't even mine to tell. It was everything that happened with my family. And I think oftentimes with hostages and wrongful detainees, for every one of them, there's a family that's going through the hardest thing they've ever gone through in their life. And sometimes I feel like they had the hard part. Sometimes I feel like just being in captivity was almost easier than what they were going through. It's remarkable what happened. So the way that the book is structured is it's essentially two stories being told simultaneously. It's kind of like this Apollo 13-esque story where there's this under-resourced entity stuck, and then there's this group of people trying to help the people on the inside. The difference is that in Apollo 13 they could talk to each other, but it's kind of like this similar structure, and it's really two stories being told because really half the story wasn't even mine. It's my family, and I believe they're the heroes.
But what were they doing? I mean, I know that your sister called a college friend just to tell her what was going on, and she amazingly had a connection through her family to a Lebanese general who had one of the few people who had a connection with the Assad regime. I mean, talk about a small world, talk about there being incredible connections. What was that relationship?
Yep. So everything that happened, I've learned it after the fact. So it's kind of me recounting it kind of from a distance. But essentially, the news of my disappearance was learned through me going dark. I was always very good about keeping in touch on my travel journey, especially if I was in more of an unstable place. And I had communicated that I was going to be in Syria for just a few days. And when that time passed and they weren't hearing from me, they began to worry. And my father works in civil engineering. My mother's a registered nurse turned educator. Both of them they're smart people, but they're an average family from Middle America. They had no idea what to do when their son went missing in the Middle East. But thankfully, they began to act, and they reached the FBI field office in St. Louis, our hometown, and that pretty quickly escalated some of the highest levels of the U.S. government in Washington. But throughout my captivity, the government really communicated two key things to my family. The first, they said, we strongly recommend that you keep this out of the news, keep all of the communication very tight. Don't let the press get a hold of this, because if they do, and Sam's captors, depending on who they are, which was still unknown at the time, feel that type of pressure, they might just kill him. And the second thing they said was, you should really manage your expectations. We have no diplomatic or economic ties with Syria. There may not be a whole lot we can do here to help. And 3 weeks later, as you were hinting at, my younger sister, Stephanie, who was 25 years old at the time, living in Nashville, she particularly became entirely overwhelmed with everything that was happening. And she decided that she needed to call someone and talk to them about this and just kind of blow off some steam, which was against the recommendation of the U.S. government of keeping all of the communication very tight. And she decided that she was going to call her former college roommate, who is coincidentally also named Stephanie. So there's this kind of phone call between the Stephanies, and as the story goes, it's really just like hey, how you doing? And my Steph says, well, actually, things aren't very good. My brother's been missing for weeks. Nobody's heard from him. We're working with all of these officials and agencies. Nobody's been able to help. We're really scared. And roommate Steph was shocked, of course, to hear something like this, but said all the right things, offers her full support. And at the end of the call, again, kind of as the story goes, roommate Steph says, hey, if there's anything I can do, just let me know. And my sister responded. She said, well, unless you know someone who knows Assad, the Syrian president, please just pray. And roommate Steph, kind of a light bulb went off, and roommate Steph said, wait, let me call you back. And it turns out that roommate Steph is Lebanese, and her uncle is good friends with General Abbas Ibrahim, who heads Lebanon's internal security. And General Ibrahim has a somewhat back channel relationship with the Syrians, and was able to speak with his counterpart in Damascus and mediate my release when so many others were struggling to do anything. And this was kind of the situation where the FBI, the CIA, the White House, the Pentagon, Pope Francis was involved. Russian intelligence, Middle East NGOs, private sector security companies were truly all kind of struggling to be effective, or weren't really willing to share information. But my sister's college roommate could identify a path to get an American hostage released from captivity in Syria.
Incredible. And all of those are reasons why people should read the book, because that's so many of those are reasons why it's so interesting. There has been a long sort of dialogue about whether the families of hostages should go public. And I know that you've done some work with the James Foley Foundation, and I've spoken to his mother, and it was near Jim when he was taken in Syria.
Wow.
Where do you stand on on that? You know, I mean, because the James Foley Foundation has almost changed the way the State Department actually looks at hostages abroad. I mean, do you think that it was right to stay? I mean, it worked for you staying silent, but it must have been a difficult decision for your parents.
Yeah, for sure. And they would be equipped to kind of answer, at least from their standpoint, what they were thinking. And I think that all of these cases are different. They're all different. And in some situations, different courses of action make the most sense. Whether to go public or not was one of the key decisions that my family was facing. And there were some people who were telling them, hey, let's put this on the front page of the New York Times, and Sam's captors, if they feel that pressure, there could be an opportunity for them to make a deal and then release him. At the same time, of course, once somebody goes public, they can't go unpublic. So it's a significant decision. And I think it's case by case. And the Foley Foundation has become kind of the authority, at least from a nonprofit standpoint, on these cases, and try to support families as best they can with an incredibly important decision.
Yeah. I wonder if we could wrap up just by talking about sort of the idea of resilience in general. You know, you say in the book also that, you know, you don't hate anyone because of this. You haven't developed those sentiments inside you, and you've come out of this, and everything you write and all the speeches you give are really positive. You know, it's about getting through difficult times. And, you know, say someone is listening who's gone through something difficult. You know, what would you say to them that you have learned from this, or that you can impart on them about what it's like to get through things like this, and how you find that strength to do so?
Well, I'm trying, and a lot of that has been a result of being surrounded by fantastic people, this overwhelmingly purposeful support system, as well as my faith. But essentially, I think that when we feel the most lost, we often have the best chance for a huge breakthrough. I mean, Syria doesn't define me, but it has become a part of who I am. And I expect the lessons that I learned through being in captivity to stick with me in some shape or form for the rest of my life. I mean, I don't want to be known for the things that happen to me. I want to be known for the way I've responded to them. And I hope that the readers of this book will adopt a similar mindset and implement it into their own personal and professional and spiritual lives. And people ask me quite a bit, you know, Sam, if you could go back, for example, would you still travel the way you did, or still go on this trip? And on one hand, I would never want to relive captivity, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But on the other hand, and I think more importantly, I would also never want to give up everything that's come from it. The opportunity to meet some remarkable people. I mean, this podcast is an example, to grow in character and in faith and in understanding, really, Ben, of the stuff in life that actually matters. And those two things can go together. So it's really about recognizing that rock bottom can teach us things that a mountaintop never could, as long as we choose to view it that way. Yeah,
spot on. I couldn't agree with you more. Well, last question: what do you do next? Where does it take you? I mean, how do you take everything that's happened and go fit back into a normal life, or how do you plan from here?
Yeah, I'm trying, but I now run my own speaking business. I speak about this experience to try to pay it forward and use it to help others. I also have, of course, this book coming out, which I'm excited to put that out there, and hopefully it will help somebody. Hopefully someone will take something from it and apply it to their own life. But that's really where my focus is right now. I never could have expected where life was going to go, but here we are, and been really just fortunate to be surrounded by some great people.
Yeah. Sam, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for the message you have sent out to so many different people, and keep spreading it, because I know people listen to this, and I know how much support it gives them. So, hey, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you, Ben.
We'll be back in a moment with Searching for Heroes. Well, I think really, again, what Sam touched on, well, so many things that I thought are really interesting right there, is that, it's not just and I feel this personally as well, it's not just the person who goes through something that is most affected by it. It is the people around him. Listening to Sam talk about what his family were going through, how the hard times they went through, how they geared themselves, how they found a way through, is also, I think, such an important message too. I think the people who just say it's about them, they went through something difficult, poor them, those are people that I have less respect for in some senses. It's the people who say, yeah, I went through this, but so did so many other people around me, and we got through this together. I love that message. So thanks for joining us today, and thank you for listening, and I will look forward to speaking to you all next week. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.